A terrified leopard had never felt a gentle hand until this man changed everything. The afternoon light filtered through the curtains of the small living room, casting long shadows across the worn carpet where Thomas Grant sat beside his wife Eleanor. The documentary flickered on their old television set, its narrator speaking in measured tones about the crisis facing Africa's wildlife. Thomas had seen countless documentaries in his 73 years, but something about this one held his attention with unusual intensity. "Another poaching report from Kenya," Eleanor murmured, her thin fingers intertwined with his weathered ones. She had grown frail in recent months, though her spirit remained as fierce as the day he'd met her 48 years ago at a USO dance in San Diego. The camera panned across a makeshift veterinary station in the African savannah, where conservationists worked frantically to save rescued animals. Then, for just a few seconds, the lens captured something that would haunt Thomas for years to come: a female leopard. Her spotted coat dull with neglect, eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to pierce through the screen. Her gait was uneven, one front paw held gingerly off the ground where claws had been brutally torn away by the chains that had once bound her. "Oh, Thomas," Eleanor whispered, her voice catching. "Look at those eyes." Thomas leaned forward slightly, his structural engineer's mind automatically cataloging the details: the cramped transport cage, the inadequate ventilation, the way the animal pressed herself into the farthest corner as if trying to disappear entirely. But it was her eyes that remained with him long after the documentary moved on to other subjects. Eyes that spoke of betrayal so complete, trust so thoroughly shattered, that Thomas felt something crack inside his own chest. "I wish we could help somehow," Eleanor said, though they both knew their modest retirement savings and Thomas's declining health left little room for grand gestures. That night, Thomas lay awake listening to Eleanor's steady breathing beside him, but his mind kept returning to those eyes. In his dreams, he found himself reaching toward the screen, trying to offer some wordless comfort to a creature who had clearly given up on human kindness entirely. 3 months later, Eleanor passed away peacefully in her sleep. Thomas held her hand as the morning light crept across their bedroom, feeling as if the ground beneath his feet had simply vanished. The house filled with well-meaning neighbors and distant relatives, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. At the funeral, people spoke of Eleanor's warmth, her volunteer work at the local animal shelter, her fierce loyalty to those she loved. Thomas nodded and thanked them, but inside he felt as empty as a house with all its windows broken. The diagnosis came 6 weeks after Eleanor's funeral. Dr. Martinez, who had been treating Thomas's various war-related ailments for over a decade, delivered the news with gentle directness. "Your heart is failing, Thomas. We're looking at maybe 2 years, possibly less." Thomas sat in the sterile examination room, processing this information with the same methodical approach he'd once used to analyze structural load-bearing requirements. "What are my options? We can manage the symptoms, keep you comfortable. There are treatments that might extend—" "I mean where?" Thomas interrupted quietly. "Where do I want to spend whatever time I have left?" Martinez studied him carefully. "There are excellent facilities." "No." Thomas shook his head. "I want to do something useful, something that matters." That evening, Thomas sat in his empty kitchen, Eleanor's coffee mug still in its place on the counter. He picked up the phone and dialed information. "I'm looking for wildlife rescue centers," he told the operator, "somewhere that might need help with construction or repairs." The voice that answered at Redwood Haven Wildlife Rescue Center belonged to Dr. Sarah Chen, the facility's director. She listened as Thomas explained his background: 40 years as a structural engineer, military service in Vietnam, recent loss of his wife, and his desire to spend his remaining time doing something meaningful. "We always need help with enclosure maintenance and upgrades," Dr. Chen said carefully. "But I have to be honest, Mr. Grant, this isn't easy work. Many of our animals have suffered severe trauma. They're not like pets." "I understand," Thomas replied, though he couldn't yet imagine how true those words would prove to be. Redwood Haven sprawled across 200 acres of forested land in Northern California, a patchwork of enclosures, rehabilitation buildings, and winding dirt paths that connected the various animal habitats. Thomas arrived on a crisp October morning, his pickup truck loaded with his tools, and a single suitcase containing his few remaining possessions. Dr. Chen met him at the main office, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and hands that bore the small scars common to those who work closely with wild animals. "We've prepared a small cabin for you," she said, leading him along a path lined with towering redwoods. "It's not much, but it's quiet and close enough to the work areas that you won't have far to walk." The cabin was indeed small, just a bedroom, bathroom, and kitchen area, but it had a wide window that looked out into the forest, and Thomas found the simplicity comforting. After Eleanor's death, he'd grown tired of possessions, of things that needed dusting and maintaining and remembering. "Your first project is repairing the big cat enclosures," Dr. Chen explained, handing him a clipboard with detailed specifications. "We have 3 leopards, 2 mountain lions, and an elderly jaguar. Most of them are permanent residents too injured or traumatized to ever return to the wild." Thomas studied the blueprints, his practiced eye immediately identifying structural weaknesses and areas that could be improved. "This fencing system could be reinforced," he noted, pointing to a corner joint. "And the drainage here looks inadequate." "That's exactly why we need you," Dr. Chen smiled. "Our previous maintenance volunteer was handy, but he wasn't an engineer. These animals deserve the best possible living conditions." The next morning, Thomas began his survey of the big cat area. The mountain lion's enclosure was spacious and well-maintained, with climbing structures and shaded areas that clearly provided environmental enrichment. The jaguar, an ancient female named Carmen, watched him with detached interest as he examined the integrity of her habitat's retaining walls. But it was the third enclosure that stopped him cold. The chain-link fencing was adequate, and the basic structure sound. But the space felt wrong in ways that had nothing to do with engineering principles. It was darker than the others, shaded by overgrown vegetation that blocked natural light. The concrete floor was stained and cracked, with poor drainage that left puddles of stagnant water in the corners. But more than the physical condition, there was something about the atmosphere itself, a heaviness that seemed to press down on anyone who approached. And in the farthest corner, pressed against the back wall as if trying to melt into the concrete itself, was a leopard. Thomas's breath caught in his throat, even from a distance. Even though she was curled into the smallest possible ball, he recognized her immediately, the same spotted coat, now dulled by captivity, the same way of holding one front paw slightly off the ground, and when she lifted her head at his approach, the same eyes that had haunted his dreams for over a year. "That's Serafina," said a voice behind him. Thomas turned to find Dr. Chen approaching, her expression troubled. "She came to us 8 months ago from a private collector who'd been keeping her illegally. She's the one I was thinking of when I warned you this work wasn't easy." Thomas moved closer to the fence, his footsteps deliberately slow and quiet. Serafina's eyes tracked his movement, but she made no attempt to flee or threaten. She simply watched, as if evaluating whether this new human represented yet another disappointment in a long series of betrayals. "She doesn't interact with anyone," Dr. Chen continued. "We've tried everything, different caretakers, environmental enrichment, medication to reduce anxiety. She eats, but only when no one is around. She won't use the climbing structures or the den box we built for her. Just stays in that corner, day and night." Thomas studied the enclosure with new eyes, seeing it now not just as a structural problem to be solved, but as a home for a soul that had given up on the possibility of comfort. The fencing was too close to the back wall, creating a tunnel-like feeling rather than an open space. The concrete floor was harsh and cold, offering no natural surfaces for an animal that should be walking on earth and leaves. The drainage problems meant she was living with the constant smell of mildew and standing water. "How long was she with the private collector?" Thomas asked. "We estimate about 3 years, based on her age and condition when she arrived. He kept her in a basement cage barely large enough for her to turn around. Chained her when he wanted to show her off to visitors." Dr. Chen's voice carried carefully controlled anger. "By the time the authorities seized her, she'd lost 2 claws on her front left paw where the shackles had cut through to the bone." Thomas nodded slowly, pieces of a terrible puzzle falling into place. This was the same leopard from the documentary, he was certain of it. Somehow, the long chain of rescue, recovery, and relocation had brought her here, to this place where he himself had come seeking purpose in his final years. "I'd like to redesign her entire enclosure," Thomas said quietly. "Not just repair it completely, reimagine it." Dr. Chen looked surprised. "That would be a major undertaking. We're talking about weeks of work, possibly months, and there's no guarantee it would help her psychologically." "Maybe not," Thomas agreed, his eyes still on Serafina's huddled form. "But she deserves a chance to decide for herself whether she wants to heal." That afternoon, Thomas sat on a wooden stool about 10 feet from Serafina's enclosure, a yellow legal pad balanced on his knees as he sketched preliminary designs. She watched him warily at first, but as the hours passed and he made no sudden movements or sounds, her vigilance seemed to ease slightly. When the dinner volunteer arrived with her food, a portion of raw meat placed inside the enclosure through a special feeding chute, Serafina waited until both humans had moved away before approaching to eat. Thomas stayed until dark, adding details to his drawings and occasionally glancing up to meet her gaze. Each time their eyes connected, he felt an odd sensation, as if they were having a conversation in a language neither of them had learned yet. The next morning, he returned with his measuring tape and clipboard, beginning the careful process of documenting every dimension of her current space. Serafina watched from her corner, but Thomas noticed she'd shifted position slightly, still pressed against the back wall, but now facing toward him rather than away. "Good morning, Serafina," he said softly, his voice barely above a murmur. The hearing loss he'd suffered from artillery explosions in Vietnam meant he often spoke more quietly than he realized, a habit that seemed to put the Leopard at ease. Over the following weeks, Thomas established a routine. He arrived each morning just after sunrise, greeted Serafina with the same gentle words, and spent the day working on various aspects of her enclosure renovation. He replaced the cracked concrete with a natural substrate of earth and sand, installed a sophisticated drainage system that would keep the space dry even during California's rainy season, and began constructing what he privately thought of as a miniature forest. The work was physically demanding, especially given his deteriorating heart condition. Some days he had to rest frequently, sitting on his stool and catching his breath while Serafina observed his struggles with what seemed like growing interest. She'd begun moving around her enclosure more, though she still avoided the areas where he was actively working. One particularly difficult afternoon, as Thomas struggled to position a large piece of driftwood that would serve as a climbing structure. He had to stop and lean against the fence, his chest tight with pain. When he looked up, he found Serafina standing just a few feet away, separated only by the chain-link barrier. Her head was tilted slightly, and for the first time since he'd known her, her eyes held something other than wariness. They held what looked almost like concern. "I'm all right, girl," Thomas whispered, touched by this small gesture of connection. "Just need to pace myself better." That evening, he made a decision that would have seemed foolish to anyone else at the facility. After the day staff had gone home and the nocturnal quiet had settled over Redwood Haven, Thomas returned to Serafina's enclosure carrying a folding chair and a small framed photograph. He set up the chair about 8 feet from the fence, close enough to feel connected, far enough to respect her need for space, and placed the photograph on a nearby tree stump where she could see it. It was his favorite picture of Eleanor, taken during their honeymoon at Yellowstone National Park. She was laughing at something he'd said, her face bright with joy and mischief. "I thought you might like to meet my wife," Thomas said quietly, settling into his chair. "Her name was Eleanor. She would have loved you, I think." Serafina had retreated to her corner when he first arrived, but as the minutes passed in silence, she began to venture closer. Thomas sat perfectly still, occasionally glancing at the photograph, but mostly just existing peacefully in the shared space. After about an hour, something extraordinary happened. Serafina approached the fence directly in front of where Eleanor's picture sat, and very gently, almost reverently, she touched her nose to the chain link, as close to the photograph as she could get. Thomas felt tears running down his cheeks, though he couldn't have said exactly why. "Thank you," he whispered. "She always said that if you found a soul that was still afraid, that was exactly where you should stay." From that night forward, Thomas's evening visits became a ritual. He would arrive after dinner, set up his chair and Eleanor's photograph, and simply sit with Serafina in comfortable silence. Sometimes he spoke quiet stories about his life with Eleanor, memories of places they'd traveled and dreams they'd shared. Other times he said nothing at all, finding peace in the simple act of being present with another wounded soul. As autumn deepened into winter, the transformation of Serafina's enclosure took shape like a living sculpture. Thomas had created something that was part habitat restoration, part architectural marvel, and part love letter to the wild spirit of a creature who had nearly given up on the possibility of trust. The miniature forest was anchored by 3 large oak logs that Thomas had salvaged from a construction site, positioning them to create multiple levels of climbing and resting opportunities. Between them, he'd woven a network of smaller branches and installed platforms at various heights, all designed to give Serafina choices about where to spend her time. The ground cover was a carefully curated mixture of native plants, fallen leaves, and natural substrates that would feel familiar beneath her paws. But the crowning achievement was what Thomas privately called the transition room, a semi-enclosed area that connected Serafina's main enclosure to a much larger forested plot where she could eventually practice the skills she would need if she ever chose to return to the wild. The transition room could be opened or closed depending on her comfort level, allowing her to control her own gradual reintroduction to a more natural environment. Chenin was amazed by the sophistication of the design. "This is better than anything we've built here," she told Thomas one afternoon as they surveyed his work. "You've essentially created a rehabilitation system that allows her to heal at her own pace." Thomas nodded, though his attention was focused on Serafina, who had begun spending more time exploring the enrichment structures he'd built. She still returned to her corner during the day when staff members were present, but in the early mornings and evenings, she could often be seen testing the climbing logs or resting among the artificial fallen leaves. The real breakthrough came on a rainy December evening. Thomas had arrived for his usual visit to find Serafina pacing restlessly in her enclosure, clearly agitated by the weather. Instead of retreating to her corner as she normally did when he appeared, she remained in the center of the space, watching him with unusual intensity. Thomas set up his chair as always, but something felt different about the atmosphere between them. When he looked up from arranging Eleanor's photograph, he found Serafina standing directly at the fence, closer than she'd ever voluntarily come before. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then, very slowly, Thomas lowered his head in a slight nod, a gesture of respect he'd seen Eleanor use with frightened animals at the shelter where she'd volunteered. To his amazement, after several seconds, Serafina lowered her own head in response. It was such a small gesture, barely noticeable to anyone who might have been watching. But to Thomas, it felt like the first word in a new language they were creating together. From that night forward, they exchanged this quiet greeting each time he arrived and again when he left, a ritual that belonged only to them. As winter gave way to spring, their communication evolved in subtle ways. Thomas began bringing a white handkerchief, which he would wave gently when he arrived with Serafina's evening supplements. She learned to associate this signal with treats and eventually began responding with a soft vocalization, not quite a purr, not quite a growl, but something uniquely hers that seemed to express cautious pleasure. "You've got quite a vocabulary going there," Thomas told her one evening, chuckling as she made her special sound in response to his handkerchief signal. "Eleanor always said I was better with animals than people." Guess she was right. The relationship deepened through a series of small discoveries and gentle accidents. One afternoon, Thomas realized he'd left a small can of condensed milk in his jacket pocket, a leftover from his morning coffee. When he pulled it out to dispose of it properly, Serafina's entire demeanor changed. She approached the fence with more direct interest than he'd ever seen from her, clearly drawn by the sweet scent. On impulse, Thomas opened the can and pushed it through the fence using a long stick. Serafina's reaction was immediate and joyful. She lapped up every drop of the thick, sweet milk with obvious pleasure, then spent several minutes licking the can completely clean. "Well, I'll be damned," Thomas murmured, delighted by this glimpse of simple animal pleasure. "You've got a sweet tooth." From that day forward, Serafina began examining him thoroughly each time he arrived, sniffing carefully at his jacket and pockets as if conducting a thorough inventory of potential treats. Thomas found himself looking forward to these inspections, often hiding small surprises, a piece of jerky, a biscuit, sometimes another can of condensed milk, just to see her tail twitch with anticipation. "You check me more carefully than Dr. Martinez does," he told her one evening, laughing as she gave his left pocket particularly intense scrutiny. "At least you're more thorough." Their trust grew through these small exchanges, but it was tested one day when the Thomas arrived without any treats at all. He'd been feeling poorly that morning and had forgotten to pack his usual selection of surprises. When Serafina's investigation of his pockets yielded nothing, she actually turned away from him, a clear expression of disappointment that was somehow more encouraging than indifference would have been. "I'm sorry, girl," Thomas said, genuinely contrite. "I promise I'll do better tomorrow." Fortunately, he discovered a forgotten sesame biscuit in his lunch bag, which he offered as an apology. Serafina accepted it graciously. But Thomas made a mental note: never underestimate the importance of consistency in building trust. The sound of his approach became part of their ritual as well. Thomas drove an ancient Ford pickup truck and with an engine that made a distinctive wheezing sound on cold mornings. Over time, Serafina learned to recognize this audio signature, often lifting her head and moving toward the front of her enclosure, even before he came into view. One spring morning, Dr. Chen mentioned that she'd observed this behavior. "She knows you're coming before any of us do," she said with a smile. "That old truck of yours announces your arrival from half a mile away." The most significant milestone in their relationship came when Thomas decided to give Serafina a gift. He'd been thinking about it for weeks, something that would symbolize their connection without being intrusive or overwhelming. Finally, he settled on a collar made from soft fabric, hand-embroidered with the words "best friend" in simple letters. He introduced it gradually, first showing it to her through the fence, letting her examine it and catch his scent on the material. When he finally placed it in her enclosure, she ignored it for several days. But then, one morning, he arrived to find her wearing it, apparently having put it on herself sometime during the night. The collar became precious to her in a way that surprised everyone at the facility. When veterinary staff needed to remove it for a routine health check, Serafina became genuinely distressed, refusing to eat until it was returned. Dr. Chen decided to have a second, identical collar made so that one could always remain with Serafina while the other was being cleaned or maintained. "It's clearly become a comfort object for her," Dr. Chen explained to Thomas. "Like a security blanket, it represents your bond." As spring progressed into summer, Serafina's overall demeanor underwent a remarkable transformation. She began using all areas of her enclosure, climbing the structures Thomas had built and basking in the patches of sunlight that filtered through the canopy he'd created. Her coat grew glossy and full, and the limp from her missing claws became less pronounced as she regained confidence in her movement. Most significantly, she began showing interest in the transition room Thomas had constructed. At first, she would only peer into it from the doorway. Then she began making brief exploratory visits, always returning quickly to the security of her main enclosure. Eventually, she started spending entire afternoons in the larger space, practicing hunting behaviors with the enrichment toys the staff provided. Dr. Chen began discussing the possibility of full rehabilitation and eventual release. "Her progress has been extraordinary," she told Thomas during one of their regular consultations. "A year ago, I wouldn't have thought it was possible, but now..." Thomas felt a complex mixture of pride and sorrow at this news. He'd known from the beginning that success would mean letting Serafina go, but the reality of that separation was more difficult to contemplate than he'd expected. The veterinary students who rotated through Redwood Haven began to take special interest in Serafina's case. Chen used their relationship as a teaching example, though she was careful to emphasize the unique circumstances that had made their bond possible. "Mr. Grant's approach demonstrates something we don't always remember in veterinary medicine," she told a group of students during one of their weekly seminars. "Sometimes the most therapeutic thing we can offer a traumatized animal is simply our respectful presence. Not every healing requires intervention." One of the students, a young woman named Jennifer, who was specializing in wildlife rehabilitation, began spending her free time observing Thomas and Serafina's evening interactions. "It's like they're having conversations," she reported to her classmates. Not with words, obviously, but there's definitely communication happening. Thomas was touched by the student's interest, though he remained modest about his role in Serafina's recovery. I'm not doing anything special, he insisted when Jennifer asked him about his methods. I'm just showing up. Sometimes that's all anyone needs, someone who shows up consistently and doesn't ask for anything in return. As autumn returned, nearly a full year since Thomas had first arrived at Redwood Haven, the discussions about Serafina's release became more concrete. The transition room had served its purpose. She was spending most of her time in the larger forested area, demonstrating all the behaviors she would need to survive in the wild. Her hunting skills had returned, her territorial instincts had reawakened, and her physical condition was excellent. The release plan was carefully designed to give her the best possible chance of success. She would be transported to a protected preserve about 50 miles north, an area with suitable prey populations and no territorial conflicts with existing leopards. A tracking collar would allow researchers to monitor her progress without interfering with her natural behaviors. Thomas supported the plan completely, though his heart ached at the thought of saying goodbye. He'd come to Redwood Haven seeking purpose in his final years, and Serafina had given him something more valuable than he'd ever hoped to find, through helping her heal. He discovered his own path through grief and toward acceptance of his approaching mortality. The night before her scheduled release, Thomas made his usual visit to Serafina's enclosure. She seemed to sense that something was different, perhaps picking up on the subtle changes in routine that had preceded other major transitions in her life. Instead of their usual quiet companionship, she paced restlessly, occasionally vocalizing in ways he'd never heard before. I know, girl, Thomas said softly. Tomorrow's going to be different, but you're ready for this. You're strong enough now, as if in response to his words. Serafina approached the fence and pressed her face against the chain link, as close to him as the barrier would allow. Thomas reached out slowly, and for just a moment, their fingertips and nose nearly touched through the metal mesh. Thank you, he whispered, for teaching me that trust is always worth the risk. The morning of the release, Thomas made a decision that surprised Dr. Chen and the rest of the staff. He chose not to accompany Serafina to the preserve, instead remaining at Redwood Haven and sitting in their usual spot by her now empty enclosure. Are you sure? Dr. Chen asked. After everything you've shared with her, I thought you'd want to see her go free. Thomas shook his head. Our relationship was built here, in this space. That's how I want to remember it. He sat in his folding chair for most of the morning, Eleanor's photograph on the tree stump beside him, thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. When he finally prepared to leave, he was startled by a sound behind him. Serafina stood at the edge of the forest, about 30 yards away. The transport had been successful. Her tracking collar was in place, and she should have been miles away by now, beginning her new life in the preserve. Instead, she had somehow found her way back to the place where she'd learned to trust again. She looked directly at him for a long moment, then approached slowly until she was close enough to touch his shoulder with her nose, a gesture of farewell that carried all the gratitude and affection words could never express. Then she turned and disappeared into the trees. This time for good. Thomas remained at Redwood Haven for another year, continuing to work on various projects and mentor the students who came to learn from the center's programs. His health continued to decline, but he faced each day with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found meaning in unexpected places. Serafina thrived in her new environment. The tracking data showed her establishing a territory, hunting successfully, and eventually, to everyone's delight, raising cubs. She became something of a legend among wildlife biologists, a testament to the possibility of healing even the most severe psychological trauma. One morning, about 6 months after her release, Thomas was surprised to see a familiar spotted form at the edge of the forest near his cabin. Serafina stood quietly, watching his window. When he stepped outside, she lifted her head in their old greeting, then melted back into the shadows. She continued to visit occasionally, always at a distance, always briefly. Sometimes she brought her cubs, teaching them that not all humans were threats. The staff at Redwood Haven began to recognize these visitations as a kind of miracle, a wild animal choosing to maintain connection with the place and person who had helped her heal. Thomas's final months were peaceful. He spent his days working on smaller projects around the facility, his evenings reading or sketching, and his nights sleeping deeply in the small cabin that had become home. By his bedside, he always kept a pen and paper, working slowly on a detailed drawing of Serafina as he remembered her best eyes bright with newfound trust, gazing toward a future full of possibility. He passed away quietly in his sleep on a cold February morning, exactly 2 years after receiving his diagnosis. Dr. Chen found him in his bed, the completed sketch on his nightstand, a peaceful expression on his weathered face. The next day, something unprecedented happened. Serafina appeared at the edge of the forest with her two cubs, now nearly grown. She led them past the cabin where Thomas had lived, pausing briefly at the place where his truck used to park each morning. Then she continued to her old enclosure, where she sat quietly for several minutes before disappearing once more into the wild. But perhaps the most touching tribute came the following week. Staff members discovered a freshly killed rabbit placed carefully in front of Serafina's former enclosure. It was untouched, clearly meant as an offering rather than a meal, in the wild. Predators sometimes leave gifts for pack members or allies, a gesture of respect and gratitude that transcends species boundaries. Thomas Grant had come to Redwood Haven seeking a way to spend his final years meaningfully. Instead, he discovered that healing both his own and Serafina's required nothing more than patience, consistency, and the willingness to show up each day with an open heart. Their story became part of the center's teaching curriculum, a reminder that sometimes the most profound connections form not through grand gestures, but through the quiet accumulation of trust. One gentle encounter at a time. In the years that followed, other traumatized animals would be housed in the enclosure Thomas had rebuilt. But the space itself seemed to carry a kind of peaceful energy, as if the love and patience that had once filled it had somehow become part of its permanent character. New volunteers would often comment on the atmosphere there, how even the most fearful animals seemed to settle more quickly in that particular habitat. And on quiet evenings, when the wind moved through the redwoods and the last light of day filtered through the canopy Thomas had so carefully designed, those who knew the story might glimpse a familiar spotted form at the forest's edge, a wild spirit choosing to remember the human who had taught her that trust, once lost, could still be found again.